Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So, in our previous lecture, we were understanding how the food extracts energy from food and then creates energy in the form of ATP. And that's really where we're going to be spending the majority of our time today, is understanding this process of aerobic respiration. So, essentially, aerobic respirations is a series of reactions that occur in the cell that converts food to energy. So, I'm sure that all of you in high school learned that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, but you might not have learned why. And in reality, it's because the final two steps in the aerobic sorry, I lost my mouse, um, in the aerobic respiration pathway occur within the mitochondria. So within this mitochondria, this is what allows us to create ATP, that really important molecule, adenosine triphosphate, that allows the cell to do work. So, an important aspect of understanding aerobic respiration is we have sort of these three main steps. We have glycolysis, the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and then we have the electron transport system. Um, and all of this aerobic respiration, again, from the root aero, is occurring in the presence of oxygen. We're going to look into what happens when we don't have oxygen. But for this important pathway, we require oxygen in order to create that ATP. So again, this is just sort of a systematic overview of this whole process of aerobic respiration. So all of this, these processes, understanding how energy is converted in the body, we have to understand this important molecule, glucose. And this is the most common source of energy for all organisms. It's a simple 6-ring sugar, and aerobic respiration of glucose is summarized in the following equation. So again, we have glucose, this simple sugar, oxygen, which is then through the reaction converted to carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. Now this equation might look sort of familiar to you, and that's because we've covered something very similar looking at photosynthesis. However, the things that are required for photosynthesis are on this side, are basically the products of this reaction, rather than the original reagents which go into that reaction. So we'll look at that a little bit more specifically. But if you're seeing something very familiar with this equation, that's because it is, and we've gone through it in photosynthesis. So we're going to be coming back to this image a lot throughout this lecture, but this is just a really good way of understanding where this is all taking place in the body. So in this case, we have our little friend glucose entering the blood vessels, again, because it's been broken down into these simple sugar units. And then oxygen from the lungs, again, enters the blood vessels, and these enter into the cells. And our first step, that glycolysis step, is all going to be taking place in the cytoplasm, then moving into the Krebs cycle and electron transport chains, which takes place in that powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. Sorry, there's a little bit of yard work that's happening in my neighborhood this weekend, so I'm sorry about the background noise. But again, and this is where we get our outputs. We get our energy in the form of ATP, our carbon dioxide, and our water. And it's worth noting the reason we need oxygen and expire carbon dioxide is because of this reaction right here. So we need oxygen in order to create ATP. As we create ATP, we get this byproduct of carbon dioxide. This is what we breathe out. So let's zoom into each of these specific processes and understand what is happening in aerobic respiration. So this is, again, understanding aerobic respiration as this multi-step process. The first one being glycolysis. Again, that's taking place in the cytoplasm of the cell. Then the citric acid cycle, which is taking place inside our mitochondria. And then lastly, the electron transport, which is creating this large amount of ATP. And I'm going to have all of you watch a great visualization, again, by the Aniba sisters, who I think do just a really good job of understanding visualizations in biology. So it's going to go through each of these moments precisely and understand, again, the reactions that are occurring at each part. But for now, it's just important to understand that aerobic respiration has 3 steps, and they each take place in a different part of the cell. So our first step that is taking place in the cytoplasm is glycolysis. And this glycolysis is what breaks down these food molecules, in this case glucose, into smaller molecules in the cell's cytoplasm. And this is then what enters the cell's mitochondria that converts into, again, those secondary steps of the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. So what are the important steps that occur in glycolysis? First, we have to understand that this is really the first step of aerobic respiration. Again, where is this taking place? This is taking place in the cytoplasm. And lastly, really what is happening here? It's a series of reactions that breaks down this glucose, again, that simple sugar, into smaller units. And that smaller unit is a molecule we call pyruvate. And it's important to note that this cycle, glycolysis, does produce a small amount of that energy molecule, that adenosine triphosphate, that ATP. So that's going to be important when we discuss this process a bit more specifically in the process of fermentation. But it's important to note that, again, a small amount of energy is taking place in this glycolysis step. So the next step in aerobic respiration is taking place inside the mitochondria, and this is the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. This is, again, our second step of aerobic respiration. And what is this exactly? So it's a series of reactions that helps extract energy, these high energy electrons from food. So again, understanding that each of these electrons is actually going to help us extract our energy. And in this case, the molecule that is most important is this NAD+. And this is what is able to pick up these electrons that are produced in the citric acid cycles. They become oxidized to become NADH, and this is what carries, again, this molecule, this important electron to the next step of the electron transport chain. So again, we need to think about what are the inputs and what are the outputs that are happening in each of these cycles. So now we're looking at this release of carbon dioxide, and that's the primary product of this reaction. And we also have a small amount of energy that is being produced in this cycle. But probably the most important thing that's happening here is our NADH molecule is able to bring this electron into the next step, which is the electron transport chain. So now we're entering the final step of aerobic respiration, or the electron transport chain. And this is where that little electron that's being brought along by NADH really comes into its own, if you will. So now that we've had basically these electrons that have been stripped during that citric acid cycle are carried into now the inner membranes of mitochondria. So this final step takes place in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And these electrons are basically passed down a chain of molecules. So this electron is being passed down all the way through a chain of molecules to oxygen that is now entering into this reaction. And this oxygen accepts this free electron that we have and combines with hydrogen atoms to produce our output of water, and most critically, 36, again, this is in a sort of a perfect system, so it's not going to be 36 ATPs every time, but in this, if everything works perfectly in the cell, we get 36 ATP that are produced through this reaction of electron transport. And this really unique enzyme in ATP synthase is really what is responsible for creating this large amount of ATP that the body is then able to use as energy. So let's zoom back out. So we've been talking about how glucose, again, these simple sugars, are used by the process to fuel this aerobic respiration. But cells can also burn other molecules for fuel. So fats and amino acids both are able to fuel aerobic respiration because, again, we're able to break it down into these simple sugars and have glucose available to fuel aerobic respiration. And when we start thinking about the different energy that is stored in each of these things, fats actually have more electrons. So because there's more electrons, because that's really what that fundamental element that produces that vast amount of ATP, because fats have more electrons, they therefore are able to produce more ATP and therefore more potential energy. So again, thinking through and zooming out, understanding that these fats that have a lot more electrons and are able to produce ATP are perfect for that long-term energy storage. And so we're gonna pick up now in our next lecture, understanding what happens when we don't have oxygen available. Can bodies still make energy? And that's where we're going to pick up next week, or in our next lecture. Make sure that you watch the Amoeba Sisters visualization of both understanding what is ATP and understanding aerobic respiration, because I think they do a really good job of understanding visually what's happening at each of these steps. And sometimes it's helpful to have a video to sort of cement all the things that we talked about in this lecture. So we'll pick up there. See you soon.